Hello, Emoji here. Today we are going to be creating reusable modals using Vue.js. If you didn't know, a modal is this thing that appears when you click the button here. If you prefer blog tutorials or just want to copy and paste code, then the blog version of this tutorial will be in the description below. So I searched all around YouTube and realized that all the videos that show how to create modals are not very reusable and the code is not super clean. What you will create using this tutorial is different because you can integrate this right into any large project with no problem. Maybe that doesn't make sense at the moment, so let's get started and I'll explain along the way. I will not be covering detailed project setup in this video. I'm starting from a basic Vue app that was just created using Vue create modals, and I'm using Visual Studio Code. Vue create modals. Just like most tutorials I make, first thing we need to do is download and import Bootstrap so that we can get a few styles. Again, we don't need these styles, but it makes things a lot easier so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So just go up here to View, Terminal. You could also just go back to the terminal we used in the beginning and say npm install Bootstrap. Now that that's installed, just go over to here and open the file called main.js, and at the top you can just reference this from our tutorial. All you gotta do is take this import statement and paste it in the top of this file, and then after that you should have Bootstrap. Alright, we can really get started now. So let's go to components, and actually let's not go there. Let's go to source, create a new folder, and let's call it modules. Inside of that folder, create a new folder, call it modals, and then let's create one more folder for now and call it components. So then inside of that components folder, create a file and call it modal.vue. So these first few components that we're going to create are quite simple. So this one is only going to have a template in it, and we'll just start off with a bunch of divs. These divs simply have Bootstrap styles on them, so all these class equals modal, and then the next one's going to be modal dialog. These are all just Bootstrap styles. And the reason we're using these, like I said earlier, we don't want to go and create these styles ourselves. We could, but Bootstrap already has it, so might as well just use theirs. We got the modal dialog. One more div here. This will be the modal content. And then after that, last thing we gotta do for this file is put a slot right there. And so a slot, it's in several different front-end frameworks, and it always does the same thing in each framework, but it's also not called slots in every framework. But in Vue, slots are very useful. They let you pretty much, so when you're using this modal component, it's gonna, don't type this by the way, but it's gonna look something like this. You're gonna be like modal, and then whatever you put in here, whatever you nest inside, so like a div or anything really, this stuff, usually you can't do this, like this won't show up anywhere, but if you put a slot in the definition of your component, that anything nested inside will show up here. So yeah, that's a Vue slot for you. Okay, simple enough. Let's go on to the next component. It's also going to be really simple. Call it modal body.view, and you're going to give it a template. You're going to have a div, and on that div, we're just going to say modal body, and it's going to have the same thing, just a slot inside of it. And that is it. So the reason I'm breaking these components down into really small sections like this is so that our custom modals will be customizable. And it also just makes the structure make sense. It makes it super obvious what everything's doing. And this will make a lot more sense as we go on. Okay, cool. So let's save that. Let's do a new file, modal header.view. Same kind of thing, template. It's going to be a div again with a Bootstrap style on it. So modal header, and then a slot, and then a modal footer.view, and it's going to be pretty much the same thing, so I might just copy and paste this one into here, and then change this to modal footer. I think that's correct. Let me check. Oh yeah, by the way, so that you can check that you're using the right styles, it's really simple to like find that out. You would just like go to Google. So I would search Bootstrap modal, and then you go here and it tells you everything you need to know. So I would typically look at the examples. So like right here, you see that this modal is created using exactly what we're using. Only difference is we're like breaking it out into Vue components, so it's more readable when we use it, because this is kind of, it's a lot of stuff like broken. It's like a lot of nested HTML elements. And also we're breaking it into components, so if we don't want a modal header, we don't have to add one. Okay, next up is going to be a much more complicated component. So create another one and call it modal root.view. So this component is where your custom modals will be inserted into the DOM. This is very important and pretty different from the tutorials I saw, because what they would do is just insert their modals anywhere into any component. But what you want to do is have a single location where all modals are inserted into the DOM, and you typically want it near like the top of the tree. So what I mean by that is like app.view. This is where like your DOM kind of starts, and then in a big application, you'll typically have like many nested components. Like there would be a component inside this one, and then one inside the one inside that one, and so on. But we'll want our modal root to go here at the top of the tree so that all our modals are rendered right here. Okay, so go to the modal root. Let's start with the template here. Actually, do I want to start with the template? No, let's start with the script part of it. So, whoops, that didn't work. There we go. Alright, so first thing, let's import some files. And this first thing I'm going to import, we actually don't have it yet. But we're going to import something called a modal service from // we're going to create this later, so don't stress out about this. And then after that, we're going to import the modal we created. /modal.view. Now go down to here, and we're going to use this modal. So just include it like that. Then we're going to give this component some data. So return This is all just typical VUE syntax here. And then the only data we need is a modal. And this will be the modal that is currently rendered. Or if it's not currently rendered, it'll be an empty object and it won't be there. Okay, this next part's a bit tricky. So this is a VUE lifecycle hook called created. Pretty much when this file, or this VUE component, when it's created for the first time, it runs this lifecycle method. And what we want to do is we want to use our modal service and say $on. So what this does is it listens for events. And when it gets an event, then it does something. So we got to tell it what event to listen for. And we're going to tell it to listen for an event called open. And that event is going to send us data. And that's what we got to let this, I don't know what you call this, like a event listener, I guess. We got to let it know what data is being sent. So it's going to be a component, props, resolve, and reject. So pretty much that's obvious. It's a component. This is the props that will go onto that component. And these are two callback functions. That's related to JavaScript promises. They're kind of complicated. I'm not going to explain this right at the moment, but I'll probably explain it later. You don't need to understand it for this tutorial because it's a whole can of worms. But hopefully at some point I'll be able to explain it a little bit. Okay, so next we need to tell this event listener what to do when it hears this event. So to do that, just do an arrow function. And then inside of this is where we tell it what to do. So what you want to do when it hears an open event, we want to set this modal so that it will render on the screen. So this dot modal, it's going to equal an object. Inside the object, it's going to have a component. It's going to have props. And then it's going to have two methods. The first method is called close, which takes a value as an argument. And then inside that function, it takes our modal and it just sets it to empty so that you close it. And then it also uses that resolve function and you send the value in. So I'm going to write this next method called dismiss, and then I'll explain this resolve and reject a little bit more. So dismiss reason. It's an arrow function. Inside it does the same thing as here. Probably could have typed this faster, but that's okay. I'll just copy and paste. And then instead of resolving, it rejects, and it has a reason for rejecting. Okay, I didn't think I was going to go over resolve and reject this early, but I guess I am. So pretty much, we haven't created this promise yet, which makes it a little bit confusing. But, oh, sorry, I just realized something. I'm interrupting myself, but if you wrote components here, I meant to say component. It's supposed to match this that was passed in right here. But back to the promises. So we'll create the promise later. And pretty much what it allows us to do, it allows us to open a modal, and then if we want to, we can pause execution of the code after we open that modal and kind of pretty much wait for that modal. And once the modal closes, then that code below it will run. However, we're not even going to be messing with that in this tutorial. I feel like promises are kind of a little bit tough to grasp in the beginning, but I just thought I'd give you a little introduction. Oh, and also, so this resolve and reject, this pretty much tells the promise to end. So your modal has closed or been dismissed, so end the promise as well. And resolve is like the promise resolved correctly, like that's all good. And dismiss is kind of like the promise rejected, like kind of like an error or a warning. So an example of this would be, you can use close if you have a payment modal, and the user enters information, enters credit card information, his name, he saves it, and it closes the modal. That's a good transaction, like it went well. Dismiss is like he enters all his information, and then he accidentally presses cancel, and it loses all his information. That would be a reject, and you would probably want to show some kind of like warning, like, oh, you just lost all your data. But anyways, sorry if that's complicated. Okay, now let's go back up to the template. And first thing, we can just use a section HTML element. We could use a div here if we wanted. I'm not quite sure why I'm using a section, but let's do it. And then we're going to give it a dynamic style. And to do that, you want to use this object syntax and say modal root, which is a CSS selector that we have not defined yet, but we will. And pretty much we're going to say modal dot component. And what this is saying is fmodal.component. So modal.component is not null. So if we do have a modal, then use this CSS selector here. So I guess I might as well just go ahead and create that style. So let's go down here and say style, and then inside we called our selector modal root. Usually I would just copy and paste this because CSS, it's not really, it's kind of really simple. Like if you've never seen this, it's not super simple, but it's not something you really teach. It's something you you just practice, you experiment with it, and then eventually it makes sense. And it does, I mean, you do have to research and find out like what all these things do. But I feel like the best way is to experiment to find out what they do. Although I'm going to give you some explanations in a second once I type all this out. Also, I'm typing very slowly because I suck at talking while also typing. Okay, so one more. It's going to be the background color. And we're going to give it 1.2. Okay, so position fixed. This just makes it so that it tells you right here. Okay, never mind, that actually doesn't give you that good of a definition. So pretty much it just fixes it to a certain part of the screen. And since we said top of 0, it fixes it to the very top of the screen. Z index makes it so that your modal will appear over anything. So if you have like a button, it'll appear above it, or a header, it'll appear above it. This is 100 view width, so take up the full screen width, take up the full screen height. That stands for view height. And then we have a background color. This makes it so that when you open the modal, it's just a little bit tinted in the background to kind of like hide everything in the background. Okay, continuing on. Let's go here. And this is actually not your regular HTML element. This is a Vue thing. It's like a Vue wrapper that they provide for you. You don't have to download anything to get it. It just comes with Vue. Basically, it allows you to add entering and leaving transitions for any element or component in certain situations. So something that's super important with this is what you name it. So you say name equals, and then we're going to call it modal. So honestly, for this part, I'm not an expert. I just know a little bit about how Vue transitions work, and I looked up the documentation and found out how it works that way. And I had to do a little bit of messing around with the CSS to get it how I wanted the transition to work. So yeah, I'm just going to go to our tutorial and I'm going to copy that wherever that is. Here we are. So I'm going to take this, copy it back to the code, down to our style section here. Just going to paste it in. So the thing I was saying about the name being important, this part for all of these has to match this name you create here. So if you call this like spaghetti, then you want to make sure that these are all spaghetti too. And aside from that, the name of these CSS selectors, like the interactive part and leave active, that has to do with Vue transitions. They tell you this is how it is in the documentation, so you just gotta do it that way. And then with this is regular CSS stuff that I just kind of experimented with. I think that this tells you like how quickly the transition happens or how slowly. And then there's like different types of transitions. This I really have no idea. I've never really researched it. Cool, we have a transition. Next thing, we're gonna create a dynamic component. And in Vue, you do that like so. And it's complaining because it's not done yet. So I'm gonna put a v if, I'm gonna say modal. And what this tells us is, it's kind of similar to this thing. It says if there is no modal, then do not render anything. Then we can define the is, and we'll say modal dot component. And now you see the complaining went away. That's because the is tells what component to use for this dynamic component. So pretty much this is going to let us use, if we created like 5 custom components, say like a payment modal, cancel modal, just anything, it lets us use whichever one we want. Next, we're going to do, whoops, that's not what I was going for. We want to do vbind close equals modal dot close. So here we are passing in a close function as a prop to whatever component this is. And the close function is what we define down here, as you see. And so we define it down here, we set it to our modal, and then we can just say modal.close to pass it in as a prop to our component. So then we're going to do the exact same thing with the dismiss. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it in, and then change that to dismiss. Then we're going to do something very similar with the props. We're going to say vbind, and then say modal.props. And that passes all the props to our component. Then we're going to have one dynamic style here. So that object, inside of it, we're going to say not declock, we want dblock. So that's a display of block, and then say modal.component. So the reason we're doing this part, I actually don't understand why we have to do this. I think it has something to do with Bootstrap modals, but I could be wrong. But basically, if I left this out, or my component, like the modal, it just would never render. No matter what I did, it wouldn't render. It had a display of none. But if you say that when there is a modal, to have a display of block, then that fixes that issue. Alright, so that was the hardest component. Let's go ahead and save it. And next what we're going to do, we're going to create something called a mixin. It's a Vue thing. We're going to create these mixins so that our custom modals can use these two functions. So that may not make that much sense, but let's go ahead and create it. So let's create a new folder inside of modals and call it mixins. And then inside of that, create a new file and call it modal mixin.vue. Oh, no. I take that back. Don't call it Vue. Call it modal mixin.js. Alright, so after that, actually let me explain this a little bit. Pretty much, the Vue mixins, they let you include certain data into any file that you import them into. So let's see if I can give you an example. Let's see. Well, we don't have any components that use props, but like, say that you had a component and it had props and it had like a bunch of different props, like prop 1, prop 2, and so on. It had like 50 props, which that's probably bad design if it does, but let's say it has a bunch of props, then, and not only that, but it's like, this is a custom, imagine this is a custom component, like our modal, and if we didn't use a mixin, we would have to define like these props here, and there would just be a bunch, we'd have to define this props section every single time with all the props. So, what you can do to fix that is use a mixin, since it kind of like compacts that data into one file. So I'll show you. Let me just revert these changes I made here. Okay, so go back. So we're gonna export default object props. So like I was saying earlier, we're gonna be taking the close function and the dismiss function as props. So it's a function, and we're gonna make them required for all custom modals. So there's that one, just to be a little bit quicker. Copy that. And then we also need to do dismiss. Cool, so now we have that. So this isn't the best example because this is only like 2 props, but at the same time, like this is 12 lines of code, and instead of like in every single custom modal needing to have these 12 lines of code, we'll just have like an import of the modal mixin, and then another line to like actually let the component see the modal mixin, so it'll get these props. And after I'm done with all this, I'll kind of like review and go back over this to give like a higher level example of all these concepts, so that hopefully it'll kind of all connect and make sense. Okay, so next up, let's save that. Let's close that. Let's create another folder in modals and call it services. And then create a new file. Let's say modal.service.js. Typically, I create services whenever I need some way of abstracting logic away, and the service acts as an interface to that logic. Oftentimes, companies will do this for third-party libraries. This is because if you abstract the library away and create your own service methods for accessing the library, if the creators of that library discontinue it, then you can simply replace the logic with a different library, but the service interface you created stays the same, so you don't have to go all over the application changing the way that you use that logic. So in this case, the modal service will allow us to open modals anywhere we want with one easy method. The components that will be opening the modals, they don't have to know about the modal logic at all. They just use this modal service to open it, and that's it. Okay, so we need to create a VUE instance. So to do that, you need to import VUE from VUE and say export default new VUE. And then bam, like so. And then inside of it, all we're gonna have is one single method. And then that method is gonna be called open. And it's gonna take 2 props, or not 2 props, 2 arguments, sorry. So component and props. And what this is, pretty much, this allows you to have a default value for that argument. So if you just pass in a component and you don't pass in the second prop, then it will, then it will default to an empty object for this value. Okay, so let's go ahead, make the body for that method. And then inside the body, we're going to return a new promise, and it's gonna have an arrow function that has resolve, reject, arrow function, and then inside the promise, this is where the event is going to get emitted. So we'll say this dot $emit, which is how you emit events in Vue. And the event name is going to be called open. And then just like we were talking about earlier, it's going to pass some data. That data is going to be component, the props, and then 2 callback functions, the resolve and the reject. So as you see here, all of the data we're passing here is exactly what we are listening for inside of the modal root component. So passing all that in, it's emitting all this data. It's one object with all this data, and it's emitting it. And then this right here in the modal root component, we're listening for open events, and it takes in all that data and then is gonna use it to set what we want the modal to look like. And with that, all we need to do is create our own custom modal and open it using a button. Okie dokie, so save that. I'm just gonna close all that, go into components and create a new file and just call it test modal.vue. So first things first, template, script. I'm going to start with script area here, and I'm going to do some importing. There's a lot of stuff we got to import. So modal from /modules /modals /components /modal.vue. Now we need the other things, and we can just copy this to make it quicker. So this time we're going to import the modal header, and then do the same thing here, except it's going to be the modal footer. And yet again, we want the modal body. And then next up, this one's a bit different. So instead of doing components, we're going to say mixins, and then we're going to import our modal mixin. And it's not .vue, so make sure you take that out. You don't even have to put .js if you don't want. You can just leave it like that. And then now we just gotta also put all those things here. So modal header, modal footer, and the modal body. And then this is how you use a mixin. So simple enough. You say mixins, have an array, and say modal mixin. I don't know why that happened, but whenever I put this here, it like created this, even though I already have the modal mixin. Did I name this wrong or something? No? That was weird. But just to make this obvious, I know I explained it earlier, but just to be sure. So this mixin, what it does, it says that this component, test modal, it says that is required to have these 2 props. So it's the same thing. Like, we could have just done this. We could have just went in here and put that, and then that would do the same thing that this mixin's doing. But say if you had like a bunch of different modals, you wouldn't want to have like all this in each one when you can just have one single mixin that imports it for you. So it's just kind of like abstracting that prop declaration for you. Okay, so now let's use all these components we just imported. So I need to capitalize that. So modal. First things first, we have a modal. Then let's use our modal header. And inside of this modal header, let's put a header element, HTML header element that is. And let's just say test modal. And next up, let's do the same thing. Let's put a modal body. And inside of that, we can just put a p tag. I mean, you can put whatever you want and just say body of modal. And then one more modal footer. And inside of our modal footer, this is where we're going to put our close and dismiss buttons. So create a button, say close modal, and then define it so that when you click on that button, it calls a function called close, which is passed in as a prop through the mixin, and you can just give it a message. It doesn't really matter what you put here, but I'm just gonna say modal closed. And then, let's also, just to make this look a little bit nice, let's use some Bootstrap classes. So button and button primary, and that'll just make it look like a blue button. And let's do pretty much the same thing for the dismiss button, except here this would be dismiss. You can say modal dismissed and dismiss. Cool. That is our very first custom modal. So save that. Now let's use it by going to app.vue, and I'm just gonna get rid of this hello world junk and all this junk. We don't need all that. Alright, so then let's import our modal root right here. The modules slash modals slash components slash modal root.vue. And then we'll also need to put that right here as well, modal root. Then let's import our modal service from, you know what, instead of typing all this out, it's gonna be quicker. Oh wait, those are at different levels. Let's just type it all out, that's okay. So /modules / modals / services. And then we're gonna get our modal.service, just like that. And one more import, we're gonna import our test modal here. It's gonna be /components / test modal.vue. Then we're going to put one method inside of this component. And make sure to have that S there. Sometimes I forget that. So one method, we're gonna call it add modal. All it's gonna do, it's gonna use our modal service, and it's gonna call its open method. And we're simply gonna pass in our test modal to it. Now go up to the template here, place your modal root in there, and put a button. Oh, let's just give it this that says open modal. When you click on it, just call the add modal method, and then same thing as earlier. Let's just make it look a little bit better with a Bootstrap class. So button primary. So it's a little bit weird, like actually opening the modal in the same file where the modal root is, because they're on the same level. Usually what happens is you have a component that's like nested way down, like it's not anywhere close to app.vue. It's like nested many layers, and that's where you'll define your add modal, and then you use the modal service to open the modal, and then it sends it to app.vue, where this modal root makes sure that any modal that is open, doesn't matter which component you're opening it in, it won't open it in the it won't place your modal in whatever component. So like if I put this modal.service.open into some other component that we created, it wouldn't open it in that component. It always sends our modals to this modal root right at the top of the DOM tree. You know, I actually might have a way to show that to you in a better sort of way, but it's going to take a bit of time, so I don't know if I want to or not. I honestly feel like this is a pretty important concept, so I'm going to try and do this. If it takes like 10 minutes or something, I will clip this out of the video, but if it's useful, then I'm going to keep it. So take Hello World, for example. It's got a lot of nonsense in it, honestly. Let's just get rid of all that. Or not. Get rid of all this. Take this button here. Put it... Oh gosh. Accidentally got rid of that part of the div. Okay, so paste your button in here. And then you can take this method and put it into our Hello World component. And then we no longer need this in here, so we can take those, import them into here. We're gonna have to use different... Yeah, we'll have to change this to a dot dot and dot dot, because we're in a different file, or a different folder now. So now we have this in a totally different component. So it's going to be nested even more. And so let's say Hello World. I wonder if this will automatically import it. Oh, it did. Interesting. Alright, so let's put our Hello World component here. And then let's save this and I'll show you what we've created. Just go to your terminal, say npm run serve. Oh my god, I had to cut the video for a second there because I ran into this super confusing issue. I was like, it made me think that you had to import something to get and use promises, but you do not. Somehow I accidentally imported this up here. You don't need that. I don't know how that even happened. I think it was when I auto-completed this word, it like just auto-imported it. So yeah, that was the whole thing. So yeah, now let's run our local server with npm run serve. Okay, then you can open your browser. I actually forgot where was it saying to go? You can either open your browser and go to it, or you can just like control click this. And it should take you, there it goes. I accidentally opened it 3 times. Okay, so we have a open modal button. You click on it, and boom, you got your modal. You can either close it, or you can dismiss it. I explained the differences between those two earlier. So your example should look like this. If it does not, then you can probably go to the blog tutorial and just paste the code in because it has the exact code I used. Might be a little bit different. Otherwise, I've covered everything in this video, so make sure you didn't skip over anything. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. I hope I was able to help you out today. If so, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.